All right, we are about to start Unit 5. This is the first video of Unit 5, which starts off with Chapter 13. Unit 5 is the genetics unit, and Unit 13 discusses meiosis specifically. Not only that, but how meiosis interacts with the sexual life cycles that we see in most higher level organisms. So as we work our way through this chapter, I'm going to separate it into three distinct videos. Two of them will be relatively lengthy, and then the final one I think a little bit less so. Now this chapter lends itself to us being able to take some extra time in class and discuss some of the things that we will see in this video a little bit more in depth and kind of add a little bit more depth to some of the topics that you see. Okay, so there is a lot here that we have to understand, that we have to know. So make sure you go back and check some of these things that either having gone through all of the material or watching all the videos, that you know what all this stuff is and you can recite it and have it in your memory bank. Okay. All right. So if we are starting out a unit on genetics and heredity, we probably should know what genetics and heredity are. Heredity is the transmission of traits from one generation to the next. So we're going to talk about how that actually happens, how that literally happens, as opposed to maybe what you actually think. And genetics is the study of heredity and also of variation. Variation is a really, really important thing when we talk about passing on traits from one generation to the next, because it is the variation that natural selection can act on when we discuss things like evolution. Okay, and so variation shows that offspring differ in appearance from their parents and siblings. And when we say that people look alike in families, I always like to bring up these celebrities, right? Because it's really telling when you look at celebrities, because a lot of them have brothers and sisters, and you're like, oh my gosh, those celebrities look just alike, and it turns out that they're actually brothers. Okay. But, so they might look a lot alike. So, for instance, I pick Thor and his brothers. There's Thor in the middle. And his brother, I believe that's Liam. And then this is the unnamed brother, apparently, who's much shorter than the other two. But obviously they do share some characteristics, and that is due to the fact that they probably share some genetics, some heredity, inherited traits with their parents. And you can take a look at their parents and they don't look exactly like their parents, would be my guess. We'll talk about the instance of that actually occurring, because the odds of that actually happening, where you have a child that looks exactly like you, like literally every single trait is the exact same, is almost impossible. Okay, and so we'll talk about how the variation in traits and how the mixing of genes during the sexual life cycles can actually cause that. But obviously you're going to see some similarities and differences. Similarities, but also some differences in families. So I've put some other famous families up here. I believe this is Ice Cube. Forgive me if I'm wrong, but I know he did a movie, what was it, just recently. But the movie that he did had his son play him. It was the one about his life. Golly, I wish I remember what it was called. Somebody will tell me. But it turns out that in the movie, his son played him in the movie. Okay, and they look a lot alike. And in the movie, like when this guy's all dressed up, he looks just like him. We've got Clint Eastwood. He's an old dude now. He's like 90 now. But this is what he looked like back in the day, back in his heyday of acting. A very famous actor and director, producer. And this is his son. Yeah, they share some definite characteristics with each other, but they don't look identical, right? There are some subtle differences, right? This is a young lady, or she's a little bit older now, named Lisa Bonet, I think. She's married to, who's she married to? You guys might, she's married to Aquaman, Jason Momoa right now, I think. And she used to be married to Lenny Kravitz, and that's her daughter. And you can definitely tell that they share some characteristics. You might know Reese Witherspoon. I always have to update this thing because the stars that I pick were famous when I was younger, but this is Reese Witherspoon. She's relatively famous. You probably see her and stuff, and that's her daughter, right? They look very, very similar, but they do not look identical. They share characteristics, but those characteristics, you can tell, have some variation to them. And there's another famous family. That's mine. Those are mine. If you want to put comments on who looks like who, I always get that he looks like me, and I get that he looks like my wife, and we don't really know what he looks like. He's cute as a button, but I don't know, maybe a subtle mixture of the two. Maybe it's better to figure it out when he's older, but these are a couple years ago. These are probably 4 years ago now at this point, but I thought they were cute, so I threw them in there. You'll have to let me know in class who you think looks like who. Anyhow, I thought we'd just use those pictures of families and parents and offspring just to kind of give you an idea that offspring do acquire genes from their parents, but they don't literally inherit traits from their parents. They acquire the things that give them those traits. Okay, so I generally use the term literally very sparingly. So here I use it on purpose like this. Literally, children do not inherit particular traits from their parents. It's actually that they inherit genes. Okay, I don't, like my dad did not just package up the big nose that he has and put it into my mother's womb and then I'm born with the big nose. That's literally not how it happens. And so you have to ask yourself, okay, well, what is that? Why do I have the same big nose as my father? Well, there are things in the cells called genes, right? And the genes are responsible for the instructions to take proteins and collagens and all sorts of stuff and build my larger nose, okay? And those instructions are very similar to my dad's instructions because I literally inherited that part of him only. The genetics, the DNA. He literally gave me parts of his DNA when I was born, and that's kind of how it works. And then over the course of time, the DNA replicates, and I get many copies of it. And during parts of development, those genes in a very specific part of the body are expressed. The genes for big nose are expressed at a certain time, and then the DNA utilizes proteins to build that characteristic. So it's a big long story, but I want you to understand that it is not necessarily the physical traits that the people inherit from their parents. It's actually the genes that does that, okay? So genes are not only the units of heredity, but they are actual literal segments of DNA. And I will point this out when we get to some of the in-person stuff in class. Each gene has a specific locus on a certain chromosome. And one set of chromosomes is inherited from each parent. Okay, that's one thing that we have to make sure that we understand, is that we get initially one set of chromosomes from one parent and one set of chromosomes from another parent. Okay, and that gives us our total number of chromosomes as a baby. So the genes are passed to the next generation by gametes, also known as reproductive cells. And those reproductive cells have different names depending on where they're seen. So in a male, that reproductive cell is called sperm. In a female, that reproductive cell is called an egg. Okay, and collectively, those things are all called gametes. That's the scientific term for them. Okay. All right. So now I mentioned that genes have a specific spot on your chromosome, and now when we see when we see some of the diagrams as we work our way through this material in Chapter 13, you'll notice that a lot of the diagrams have pictures of the chromosomes. They look like the butterflies that we've seen from Chapter 12. And what you also have to understand is that those chromosomes that we oftentimes see during meiosis and mitosis, like you see in this picture here, have been packaged up and condensed very highly as a result, because it's easier to move them around. So to find where the actual gene lies, you'd have to actually unravel the chromosome a bit and get it down to its double helix DNA. And then when you've got that double helical DNA there, you can see where that gene would lie and how big that gene is, and then you package it back up. And even still, that gene will have a specific area that you will see it in when it's packaged up into a more condensed chromosome. So that gene always resides in a very specific spot or locus on the chromosome, no matter what it is. And so that's one thing we have to keep in perspective, okay? So now section 2 here gets into more in depth on what those chromosomes in human beings are. We have talked a little bit about chromosomes already, so some of this is going to be a more review, but then we're going to elaborate on even more of it, okay? So each human somatic cell, which is any cell other than a gamete, so we've got nose cells and liver cells and heart cells, and those are all called somatic cells. Okay, so just throw that in your lexicon. And each one of those somatic cells has 46 chromosomes that are arranged in pairs. And so that's one thing we have to make sure that we account for, is the fact that we have pairs of chromosomes because we got one set of those pairs from our mom, and we got another set of those pairs from our dad. And so ultimately we have two sets, and each set of those chromosomes that we got from our parents totals 23. So we got 23 chromosomes from mom, and we got 23 chromosomes from dad, and then we put them together in one cell, which is us, and that is a total of 46. Oftentimes that gets relatively confusing when people try to parse this out, and I will do a demonstration in class where I'll kind of help you understand that using the pool noodle chromosomes. Okay, so the two chromosomes in each pair are called homologous chromosomes, or homologs, and this includes one chromosome from each parent. And so one thing that homologous chromosomes have in common, and we've talked about this already in chapter 12, is that they are the same size. Okay, so if I'm talking about chromosome 1 from mom and chromosome 1 from dad, they're the same size. Like my fingers here are the same size. The other thing that you'll notice is that they also have the exact same genes. Okay, so if I'm talking about, if you can see real close up, yeah, all of your fingers have, this is impromptu demo right here, all of your fingers have these little creases on them right here, and my index finger creases should line up, and those creases can represent genes, right? So this top one here maybe represents a gene for eye color, and this one represents a gene for hair color, and they happen to be located at the exact same spot on that chromosome. So that's how we can look at these homologous chromosomes and decide exactly whether or not they are homologous and whether or not they match up, and say that this one came from mom and this one came from dad, and they're together in my cells. Okay? So that's what we're talking about when we say both chromosomes in a pair carry genes that control the same inherited characteristic. If those creases on my finger there represent eye color and hair color, they would be at the same spot on both chromosomes. Okay, and so this diagram here should help you figure that out. This chromosome, this is a homologous pair. This one we can say came from mom. Okay, that's why it says maternal. Okay. And this happens to be chromosome number 11. This is from like a scientific paper or something like that. And this is paternal chromosome number 11. So this one came from my father, or this version of it came from my father, and this version of this one came from my mom. This version of this green one came from mom, and this version of the green one came from dad. Now you notice these little bands on here. Those don't necessarily represent genes. Sometimes they kind of can. Sometimes if you dye a chromosome properly, these little banding patterns can represent where a gene would lie. But in this case, that is not necessarily the case. But it is also another way that we can identify homologous chromosomes, is that if these banding patterns, when they're stained in a certain way, if they do match up, that means they are homologous pairs to some other chromosome that we might see in the cell. Okay? All right, on we move. In a cell in which DNA synthesis has occurred, each chromosome is replicated. Again, this is something that we've already talked about. And when we replicate a chromosome, it consists of two identical sister chromatids. Again, review, so we'll just motor on here. Now that starts to get a little bit confusing when we start to take into account what the homologous pairs might look like, okay? Because what we see here, these two are a homologous pair, so are these two. But when we look at this diagram, these two guys right here are homologous pairs as well. Now they look distinctly different, but we have to apply definitions of chromosomes to be able to parse out what exactly it is that we're trying to detail here. Okay, so in this diagram, these are homologous pairs of chromosomes. We can say maybe that this one on the left came from your mom, and this one on the left came from your dad. These are homologous pairs that have already replicated. If we go back a couple slides, these are homologous pairs that have yet to replicate. Okay, that is the distinction that we need to make there. And so we look at, we can also look at something called a karyotype. And a karyotype is responsible for allowing us to understand what homologous chromosomes are as well, because a karyotype is actually a way for us to stain the chromosomes in these very specific dyed patterns. We can smash the cell, and then we can take a picture of all of the chromosomes, and then what we actually do is we have a computer kind of cut that picture out. It's almost like you were cutting out something in like grade school, and then you're just matching these things up. You say, okay, I got this thing over here that has a specific look to it. Okay, it looks kind of like this one. All right, I'm going to go through the pile of chromosomes that are laying on the slide. I'm going to pick out that one and say, oh yeah, those two match real well. Those two match real well. So I'm going to put them next to each other. I'm going to glue them on a piece of paper. And that's kind of what a karyotype does. But it allows us to understand what are the homologous chromosomes. We can order them in a very specific sequence. Oftentimes karyotypes are put together in a fashion where the number one chromosome is just the biggest one. Okay, they order them based on size. Okay, so number one chromosome number one is always the first chromosome, or is always the biggest chromosome. Chromosome number two is physically the second biggest, and chromosome number three is physically the third biggest, and so on and so forth. And it turns out that they all have kind of the same banding patterns as well. Okay, and so these karyotypes can help us to match up homologous pairs as well. So with this diagram, if we were live in class, I would use it to ask a couple of questions, and I would say to you, okay, how many chromosomes are in here? Okay, and you might want to pause that and just answer it. And if you can remember what our definition of a chromosome was back in chapter 12 in first semester, you would say there's 6 chromosomes here, Sutherland. And I say, yes, you're absolutely right. Good job. Okay. And then I'd say, how many homologous pairs of chromosomes are there? And you'd look there and you'd be like, okay, homologous pairs, that means they have to match up, they have to be the same size, right? Okay, so you're looking for ones that are the same size. These two match, then these two match over here, and then, okay, these two match. They're all the same size, so there are 3 homologous pairs, Sutherland. That's what you would have said, and I would have said, yes, you're absolutely right. And so that would have been something that we could have worked through and made sure that we understood our definition of what a chromosome is, and understood the fact that when we see these things, that this is a chromosome that has already replicated. It is not 2 chromosomes. It is a chromosome with its replicate attached to it. So I've in the past had some people tell me they've counted 12 chromosomes. I've had some people tell me they've counted 3 chromosomes, but it is in fact 6 chromosomes, and there are 3 pairs. And the way that the book likes to color code these, it may be, not politically correct in these times, but they try to use blue for the male ones, and the ones that came from your father. They call those paternal ones. And they try to use red to indicate the maternal sets. And red is relatively close to pink, so those would represent the ones that came from your mom. Okay? So we've got our maternal sets of chromosomes that are represented here, and they all should have a match with a paternal set that we see down here. Okay? And that is done by size, at least in this case. All right, what else do we have to learn about chromosomes in humans? Ah, yes, the haploid-diploid issue. Okay? The haploid-diploid issue can easily be made sense of when we discuss N, the term N as equaling something. Okay? Now, when we talk about haploid and diploid, the term haploid describes a cell with one set of chromosomes. Okay? Normal, everyday cells, okay, so nose cells and finger cells and liver cells, have 2 sets of chromosomes for a total of 46, right? But there are some cells in our body that only have half that number, so they would have 23 chromosomes, or they would have 1 set. So for humans, the haploid number is 23. Gametes are examples of haploid cells in our bodies, and they contain only 1 set of chromosomes, and we're glad they do, because if you got gametes that had 2 sets of chromosomes in them, you would have large-scale issues developing your body. Okay, and we can talk about those as we continue on through this unit. But the gametes only have half the number of chromosomes of a normal body cell. And I always remember the term haploid by saying haploid sounds like half. Okay, half the original number. Now, when I see haploid, it's oftentimes represented with a lowercase n. Okay. And I equate in my head, and this would be one of the best things you can do right now, and maybe even for any other time you spend in biology. When you see the term or the variable n, automatically you should say n equals the word sets. Okay? Okay? So 1n equals 1 set. We take the 1 out because that's algebraically correct, right? So we take the 1 out. So 1n equals 1 set. 1 set of chromosomes equals 23. Okay? So that will help you, I think, realize that n equals the word set. And so a cell that has 2 sets would be described as 2n. 2 sets. 2 sets. So for humans, the diploid number is 46. So you'll see oftentimes in problems or tests, and see it in my tests and quizzes and things like that, the number 2n. Okay, 2n equals 46. So we can read that algebraically and now in English as the 2 sets that we see in our cells equal 46. Okay, which means that half of that number, or 1 set, would equal 23. So when you see 2n, that is describing something that some kind of cell that has 2 sets of chromosomes. Where did you get both of those sets? You got 1 set from your mother, and you got 1 set from your father. Okay? And I think it's important that we understand haploid and diploid, because as we work our way through the stages of meiosis, haploid and diploid are actually words that are used a lot, and you have to be able to understand that they are used in a diagram to represent something happening in the nucleus. Okay, and that is where people get very, very confused. So I want to make sure that we understand haploid and diploid before we ever get into the meiosis stages. All right. All right, on we move through sets of chromosomes. Let's talk about sex chromosomes, which we have yet to do. This is something that has not happened yet. We have not talked about sex chromosomes. So in our normal 46 chromosomes, 2 of those chromosomes are called sex chromosomes. Okay, so the sex chromosomes are distinguished as X or Y. Okay, human females have a homologous pair of X chromosomes, which means they have 2 X chromosomes. So their 2 sex chromosomes are both the X version, okay? Whereas human males have only 1 X and 1 Y, okay? So they don't really, I guess you'd kind of call it a homologous pair because it's a sex chromosome, but human males have 1 X and they have 1 Y, okay? 1 X and 1 Y. The other 22 pairs, so that's 1 pair, right? So if you're a human male, you get a pair that is represented by X and Y. Here's one of them, here's the other one. That is the pair. If you're a human female, you have this pair. You have the pair that is represented by X and X. The other 22 pairs of chromosomes that don't determine your sex are called autosomes, okay? And so that's another piece of terminology that you have to kind of get accustomed with. We've got sex chromosomes, so there's only 2 of those, and the other 22 pairs of the other 44 total chromosomes are named autosomes. Okay, so bring back the karyotype again, just to show you the difference between the X and the XY and the rest of the chromosomes. The rest of the chromosomes have a pair. The 2 that don't have a pair, if you're a male, the 2 that are kind of left all by themselves would be your sex chromosomes. Now, in the X chromosome, they have generally a specific banding pattern, so they'd be able to identify that it is the X chromosome. But the other way to identify it is the fact that it doesn't match up with any of the other ones, and it's kind of all out there by itself. Okay, but you notice how insignificant, that's a really insignificant chromosome there, the Y is. And the Y chromosome really doesn't have a whole lot on it. There's not much on it. Really the only thing that's on there is some genes that determine whether or not you get testicles, and that is the bare bones. That is it. Okay, and so it makes you wonder. Okay, how come we've got all these other chromosomes with all this crazy stuff going on with the genes on them, and they code for everything in our bodies, and we just get this little guy with just one gene on it, and it codes for male parts. So that's what determines the difference between biological male and female. All right, so what happens to these behavior of these chromosome sets in the human life cycle? And that's something we have to talk about, because that does play a role in how these traits, these genes are passed down from one generation to the next. At sexual maturity, the ovaries and the testes produce haploid gametes, and this happens at different times. Now, the males' testes don't produce sperm until they're 12, 13, 14, 15, so it depends. That kind of range. Some people have earlier, some people a little bit later. And it's interesting because females actually have produced all of the eggs that they're ever going to be born with. They've produced all of them already by the time they're born. Okay? And so when these little baby girls are there, they have all of the eggs that they'll ever need, but they have to wait until sexual maturity, until their ovaries start to drop those eggs into the uterus, okay, or start to produce those eggs for possible fertilization. Gametes are the only types of human cells produced by meiosis rather than mitosis. So these are the only cells. Sperm and egg are the only cells produced in this manner. Everything else happens through the process we've already talked about in mitosis. So it is a very limited process, but it's a very, very important one. So meiosis results in one set of chromosomes in each gamete, and that's what we're going to talk about in detail when we get into the phases of meiosis. How we take one set that is found. So we got two sets in the cells, and we take one set and we put it in this cell, and we take another set and put it in that cell, and then ultimately fertilization causes those sets to recombine in the baby, okay, which we call, the early baby is called the zygote, and that restores the diploid condition, and it forms this zygote, and the zygote ultimately develops into an adult. So we get one set that is put into some sperm in the dad, and we get one set that's put into the egg from the mom, and we get this creepy little baby coming out the other end. Okay, so that's kind of the life cycle, the sexual life cycle of human beings, and the importance of understanding all of these chromosome, all these ideas of the chromosome sets in human beings. Okay, so at this point, in the next video, I'm going to go through how meiosis works and how it works to take a cell that started out as diploid and ultimately split up chromosomes to the point where we now have a bunch of haploid cells. Okay, so I'll see you in the next video.